Some people grow up in the big city. Some people grow up in the middle of nowhere. I'd like to believe that both have their perks and fallbacks. Growing up in the city might mean you miss out on roaming the town with your friends, free of adult supervision. Growing up in a small town surrounded by an everyone knows everyone community ensures many dangers are overlooked. I grew up in a small town and always pitied those who missed out on the freedoms I was blessed with. That is, until that day. You see, I never imagined anything bad could happen to me. No one ever does, I suppose. Sure, we had some urban legends, like how the abandoned church had a female spirit that could be seen in the bell tower at midnight. This myth was ultimately busted by a few of my buddies and I breaking in and climbing it ourselves for that up-close and personal view. We never saw anything, but Robert swore he did. He took off running down the steps, screaming, and when we finally caught up with him, he was outside dry heaving and it pissed his pants. Unless spirits have the ability to control a living person's bladder, this turned out to be just a rumor to scare us. Needless to say, he was made fun of endlessly for getting scared about nothing. Robert was always the type to try and scare us. He was a practical joker, and though no one else thought so, I thought he was just trying to really sell it. Looking back on it, I think him peeing himself would have been too far to bring a joke. The thing that did scare me, however, was the cornfields. If the adults and older kids really wanted to scare us, this would have been a more effective way to do it. For context of the story, this takes place in the late 90s. I was 14 and pretty much free of any of the few strict rules my parents had on me. Again, I lived in a tiny town. The population was just over 1,000, nestled in the middle of nowhere in Minnesota. Summers were always the best. No school, no responsibilities, endless land to explore, and a close group of friends I could always count on to be available. My best buddy Cole lived 2 miles outside of town. Cole was a no bullshit, straightforward guy. Even so, he was the type of person to have on your side because he'd get to the bottom of anything. We always had the best time on his family's farm. 4-wheelers, go-karts. Hell, if we were lucky, we'd even get to drive his brother's old Bronco and rip up the land out behind the small forest in his backyard. You're probably wondering how this ties in with the overall story. Well, I'd often hang out until late at night, sometimes as late as 1 or 2 a.m. This would mean I'd have to bike a lonely, desolate road to get back home, surrounded by cornfields on both sides. I'd also have to pass an old graveyard around the halfway point. That part, surprisingly, never really bothered me. The only fortunate part about any of this was Cole's long driveway I could use to gain as much speed as I could to bolt those 2 miles. Riding in the middle of night alone, I don't think paranoia was unreasonable. But this goes beyond paranoia. I thought I could swear I sensed something with me. Every single time, it gets worse. Have you ever driven past cornfields with the passenger window down? If you haven't, try it sometimes. You'll notice the sound of your tires reverberates through the stalks of corn. Now imagine that, but on a bike, by yourself, in the middle of the night. The sound was strikingly similar to as if someone was running through the cornfield alongside me. Again, this was the 90s, so it's not like I could really research fucking wavelengths in the corn. Being a 14-year-old kid with a chip on his shoulder, I wasn't going to confess my paranoia to anyone either. I remember how much fun everyone made of Robert for pissing himself. What would they say to me if I spoke about this? So I did what anybody with a brain would do. I tried my best to ignore it. Moving on. It was a night in August, clear skies, no wind. I'll spare you the details of the day. To summarize, I went out to Cole's around 5 p.m. We spent the day riding the trails we had built and played Super Nintendo late into the night. Cole was passing all of my high scores in every game we played. I don't mind, but he kept on insisting I was getting mad about it. I wasn't. Time flew by, and before I knew it, it was 1 a.m. It was time to go. Staying the night would have been preferred because my nerves were on high alert, like a sixth sense, but staying the night wasn't something we ever did, for some reason or another. We said our goodbyes and I stepped out into the cool night, hopped on my bike, gained my usual speed, and I was off. I got about a quarter mile down the road, still pedaling as hard as I could. The sounds from the cornfield was overbearing. You could have sworn Cole's dog was running with me just one row in. The smart thing to do would be to not think about it. Keep pedaling and keep my eyes on the road. This sound, though, it was getting to me. It was driving me mad. I slowed my pace a bit, and with it the sound died down with the speed. Okay, it's just the noise of my bike. The next thing that happened should have been a red flag. The noise stopped. Completely. I look over at the cornfield and nothing looks off. Despite all logic, I felt relief. I take my eyes off the cornfield and put them straight ahead once more. Right in front of me was a black figure. I had no time to react before I was clotheslined off of my bike. I hit the ground hard. I was dazed and it sounded like a flashbang had gone off. Knowing I was in danger, I tried to get back on my feet and run, but my attempt was fruitless. I was being dragged by my foot towards the cornfield. I didn't take the time to look at this thing. I started kicking and flailing, doing anything to make it lose its grip it had on me. I lunged myself forward with my hands and kicked out with my free leg as hard as I could. Connecting with the face of this thing, its grip slipped and it fell backwards with my shoe. I got up and took off running. I didn't take the time to figure out which direction I was facing. Instead, I just ran. I could hear it gaining on me. The footsteps were rapidly approaching. I saw a single light in front of me. It was the graveyard. I knew there was no way this would help me, but I at least know I was halfway. Reaching the graveyard and standing in front of its gates, completely exhausted, I realized the footsteps had completely disappeared. Where did it go? My question was soon answered when I saw the creature's silhouette just past the graveyard, standing in the road. What was I going to do? I turned around thinking about running back to my friends, but as I did so, I heard that same noise in the cornfield. The fastest I had heard it yet. Within what had to be 2 seconds, it was now standing in the road between Cole's house and I. How is that so fast? This can't be the end. I have so much more life to live. The odd thing was, it just stood there, as if it was waiting for me. Out of options, I stood staring at this silhouette for what had to be 10 minutes. I felt sick. I was going to pass out, whether that be from the fall, the exhaustion, or fear. I leaned up against the gate, slouched down, and collapsed. I woke some time later. It's impossible to tell you how long I was out for, or if I had passed out. I don't know. When I glanced up, I finally got my first real look at the creature. His head was poking through the cornstalks across the street. He had on a hoodie. He had these bright, glowing white eyes and the whitest grin I had ever seen. He looked like a serial killer about to devour his last meal. I don't know how else to explain that grin. His skin was dark and leathery, as if he had been rotting away for some time. The fear I felt was more than I could take. I passed out once more. I awoke with the biggest headache I have ever experienced. Imagine dropping an anchor on your head. Opening my eyes seemed like a task far too difficult. The memories of the previous night began flooding my mind. It couldn't have been real, could it? No, there's no way. I had opened my eyes to find myself in bed. Everything would be fine. It had to be a nightmare. Except, my bed isn't this hard, and the birds are never this loud. Upon opening my eyes, it was confirmed. It was all real. I jolted up, remembering where the man had been, but there was nothing. I walked back to my bike, which was in the middle of the road untouched, and pedaled slowly until I got home. It was apparently still pretty early, just past 7 a.m. to be exact. Too early for my parents to be awake to start getting ready for work. Still exhausted, I laid in my bed hoping sleep would take me over. It never did. I lied awake in bed all day and passed out later that night. After that night, I became a recluse. The runner, as I would later dub this creature, ran through my mind every single day. I didn't go out anymore that summer, despite friends coming over constantly to check up on me. They'd eventually give up, the same way I gave up making sense of that day's events. School went back in session and life moved on. You see, legends like this should end after a one-time encounter. The only way these things come back to haunt you is if you let it. I made the biggest mistake of my life at the end of that school year. Maybe my second biggest mistake. It's tough to say. Either way, if I would have kept my mouth shut, this would be the end of the story. There's a chance I could have gotten past this at some point. But no, I had to fuck it all up. Robert was always a close friend. It was only natural for him to pull me aside one day after school. He cared. He always did. Remembering the incident at the church, I thought he would believe me. If there was someone to open up to, it had to be him. He had me basically pinned in a corner, explained how everyone was concerned about me. He said he just wanted to know what was going on, so I told him everything. It felt good to finally get everything off my chest. He was silent for a time. Turns out I was right to think he'd believe me. He brought up the night at the church. We hung out that night, talked about both of our stories, and the lasting effects of them for hours. Summer started and I still wasn't ready to go out. Robert would come over from time to time, and I could tell the fact I wouldn't go out bothered him. It built up for a couple of months, until it was August once more. It was an average day. I had spent my morning reading and playing video games in the living room. It was around 6 p.m. when I got a knock at the door. It was Robert and Cole. I had been right that Robert would trust me. Even so, I was wrong to think he'd keep it to himself. Cole questioned me about that night immediately once I opened the door, asked me why I let fairy tales get to my head. This was classic Cole behavior, always the logical, get to the bottom of things type. I didn't know what to say, but that didn't matter. He had already made up his mind on how to bring this to a close. His plan was to bring Robert and I out to the same road at midnight and take 10 steps into the cornfield. He would prove once and for all there was nothing to be afraid of. It goes without saying that I begged him not to do it. I'm ashamed to say that my pleas came with a few tears. Of course, he didn't listen. But what else could I do? I couldn't let him go out there and potentially get killed by the runner. I had to go with him. So we pumped up my bike's long since deflated tires, waited until 11:50 and set off into the night. My parents not questioning why, just happy to see me finally leave the confines of their home. The ride out there was silent. No cicadas, no rustling in the corn, no conversation, no anything. Just the sound of our tires on gravel. We were about 100 yards short of the graveyard when Cole stopped and said, "Here." I would have continued my pleas. I would have said anything if I could. But no, I was too terrified to choke out any words. Cole grabbed out his pocket watch and waited until it struck exactly midnight. I assume he was trying to subdue Robert's fears of the church by meeting the specific time of his encounter as well. He began walking into the corn. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. He got to 9 when he let out a blood-curdling scream. My fight or flight kicked in and I wouldn't let Cole be taken by that thing. I tore into the cornfield after him and found him, laughing. Nothing had happened. He was fine. "You really believe this shit, don't you?" he said while barely containing tears of laughter. Maybe he was right. Maybe there was nothing to fear after all. Maybe, just maybe, I had imagined everything. Even though I was mad about this prank, I felt relieved and let out a nervous giggle of my own. We walked back out of the cornfield together and looked up to see Robert standing in the middle of the road sitting on his bike. "That's not funny, Cole," he yelled. We were climbing up the small ditch, looking down at our feet to ensure we wouldn't trip and slide back down. "Robert, look out!" Cole shouted. Great, another prank. But No. The runner. He was standing right behind Robert. That same sick and twisted grin stretching from ear to ear. Robert never had a chance. The runner grabbed a hold of Robert and began dragging him and his bike into the cornfield. Robert screamed and we tried our damnedest to catch up with them. It was useless. Once they were in the corn, they were gone. The runner was fast and had to be dragging him at 60 miles per hour through the corn. Robert's screams continued for minutes on end, miles and miles into the corn. That's the end. Robert was never found. Search parties looked for him for weeks. His parents hadn't given up the search to this day. No one ever believed us, and honestly, I don't blame them. I don't know what the runner did with him. Cole never forgave himself and ended up going insane. I guess his logical brain couldn't process it. Maybe the guilt got to him. I don't know. What I do know is that I now live as far from corn stalks as I can get. I live in the desert of Nevada now, and try my best to lead a normal life day by day. I don't know if the runner is still out there. People go missing without a trace all the time. Perhaps the night of my first encounter, the runner didn't run to the other side of the graveyard. But there's a chance it could have been a friend of his. But after seeing how fast he dragged Robert, it's safe to say either is possible. I don't know for sure, and I hope to never find out. I don't have a definite reason as to why the runner didn't take me when I was at the gates of the graveyard either. My best guess is that he can only traverse the cornfields and roads in between. But again, I don't know for certain. So I ask, what do you hear when you're whizzing by a cornfield? Do you hear nothing? Or do you hear the faint sounds of footsteps? Which one is worse? Maybe if you hear nothing at all, he has already caught up to you.